G'day everyone, Dicko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. In this video, I'll be showing you a couple of methods that you can try in order to add some serious weight to your animations. And whilst it's technically not a principle of animation, adding weight to animated characters and objects is, in my opinion, one of the most important and difficult things to get right. And it's something that I, as a professional, am constantly trying to improve upon. So, I want to show you a couple of tips on how you can adjust a basic ball bounce like the one you see right here to feel really heavy or really light with just a few simple tweaks. So, I've already gone ahead and animated a basic ball bounce, and I've duplicated it across to two other rigs. And as you can see, they all have the exact same timing and the exact same keyframes. So, if you want to go ahead and hit the ground running, you can download this starter file from my Patreon. Otherwise, animate your own ball and then follow along. Alright, so let's have a quick little inspection on how this actual animation is done. And it's really simple, really straightforward. The animation itself is just a series of descending height over time. Pretty simple, and each bounce is shorter than the next bounce in terms of height and distance and timing. So each bounce that follows is a little bit shorter in timing and has less height over time as well. Pretty straightforward stuff. In some cases with some of the bounces, especially those with a bit of squash and stretch, so you can see they squash a little bit. I've added a little bit of a hold onto those bounces that do suffer from a little bit of squash and stretch. And that's about it. And that's controlled through these controls here. So these squash controls, just for a frame, just squish down for a frame and then bounce back into their original state. Okay, so let's just start off with doing the heavy ball first. Now, the first thing that obviously animators who first do this stuff get wrong is that classic sort of thing is that if all things being equal in your animation, in the world that you're animating in, is true, the rate in which something falls, and this is the same in the real world as well, is constant. So no matter how heavy something is, whether it's a coin or a bowling ball or a feather without any air resistance involved, they would fall at the exact same rate as one another. So this first fall will be exactly the same on both the heavy, the light, and the regular ball bounce. So this ball bounce here, this timing here, the way it falls and hits the ground, we aren't going to change the timing of those first 15 frames. What we will change though is the timing and the height of the ball bounce after that. So when you're animating weight or density, you are effectively emulating the way in which the ball reacts with the rest of the world, or the object reacts with the rest of the world. And it's down to its density, its mass, and of course, the substance that it's interacting with. So in this case, just the ground plane. So what we need to do is firstly reduce the amount in which it bounces. So the simplest thing to do in this case would be to change the peak height of every one of these bounces to be less. The next thing to do is to reduce the time it takes to get from the peak of that height and hit the ground again, because there's less energy being transferred back into the ball from the ground, that it will have less height to travel and therefore less time to get to that peak of movement. So we can reduce the distance between the two impacts to be less. So that's the next thing we can think about. The last thing to think about is actually the squash and stretch. So with a denser object, you're going to have less squash. It's not going to squish down and compress as it hits the ground as much. So we need to actually reduce that or eliminate it completely. So in my case, I might just, for now, just remove it. I'm just going to remove all the squash and stretch completely from that equation. Just completely remove it. I'm going to keep the first keyframe there because it has a 0 value, and just remove the amount of squash and stretch. I'm going to actually turn that off as well, just so I can see it clearly, and you can see the difference. It's already looking more robotic. simply because that squash and stretch is not present. So what I might do after that, at least for now, is I'm going to remove these holds because I don't want them in there anymore. I'm not going to remove it from here. I'm going to remove it from there for at least the first one to keep the timing of the first impact. So I'm going to remove the holds, the hold frames, just remove them completely. And from there on in, keep it even and remove the holds from there on in. Because if there's no squash and stretch, there's no point in having a hold, you know what I mean? So I'm going to remove that. And already that's changing the way it's reacting. I mean, the timing is still relatively the same, but it will make a difference in a second. Okay, the next thing to do will be to change the height overall across all of these bounces. So what I'm going to do is grab the height values from the, in this case, the COG. In this case, it's on the Z location. And I'm going to reduce it by probably about 2/3 across the board. So I'm going to grab those peak movements and just reduce them across the board to be less so. You can see that the graph editor is spazzing out a little bit because we do need to adjust the Bezier curves of those bounces to, you know, not overlap. So what I'm going to do, go to my graph editor and just turn off everything except the Z location, and just readjust these curves a little bit. Now I'm not even playing it back right now. I'm literally just going through and just cleaning things up in the graph editor because ultimately, I know how the thing's going to behave. I don't need to look at it in an animation terms just yet. I just want to see just how, by adjusting the graph values a little bit, can affect the behavior of the ball. And it's just the fastest way to work as well within the graph editor because you're not constantly like tweaking within the viewport, moving your mouse around as much, having to play things back constantly, all that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to move that back a little bit as well, just adjust that timing to be a bit more even. And let's just see how that's changed the behavior of that ball. All right, cool. So there's the ball bounce. You can see the height has changed dramatically. Let's have a look. So that's looking heavier, but also floatier. And even though the actual timing of the bounces are exactly the same, the impacts are landing on the exact same keyframes, it's floatier because it's traveling less distance over time. So it's looking slower overall, even though it's really exactly the same. So it's a bit of a trick on the eye. So the next thing to do is actually to reduce the spacing between the bounces. So reduce the amount of time between each bounce to make it feel like it's heavier. So that's pretty simple. All we need to do then is just reduce the amount of keyframes between all these bounces. So I'm just going to bring back all my keyframes here. And I might actually hide away everything except, I'm going to keep everything present except Z, and then just delete everything else because I don't need it. So I'm just going to focus purely on the Z location. And what I want to do is just reduce the amount of time between each bounce. I'm going to grab these keyframes here and just move them. Maybe I can actually go ahead and grab these keyframes from here and just scale them back and just see what happens. So what happens when I just scale them all back by a factor of, I don't know, a quarter? Obviously the timing's a bit off for now. So now we've got this really weird hang time. So if we were to play this back, it's going to like float in the air, almost stand still. So you can see that little standstill. So what we're going to do is just fix up those curves a little bit. And you can see it's looking a little bit odd as well. So making sure we even out those bounces a little bit as well. like so. All right, cool, let's play that back. So that's looking pretty good. So it looks like it's less reactive to the ground. So it's obviously feeling a lot more solid, but it's still feeling a bit bouncy. It's feeling a little bit too bouncy in a way. So it's still feeling a little bit more solid. It's feeling a bit more denser, but it still feels like it has a bit more, less density than I would like, if that makes sense. So I want to make it feel like it's really, really heavy. And when it hits the ground, it just barely moves. And the simple way we can fix that is by just removing some of the bounces. So we can actually just remove them. And I want to reduce the amount of bounces that this ball has by about maybe 3 bounces. And that will start to feel really heavy once we do that. So I'm actually tempted to remove the bounces from the start and then move these ones back, because I kind of like the way that these ones are moving right now. See how they kind of like, they feel like the timing's about right. So what I want to do is I might actually start from here, remove these keyframes, pushing X. I'm going to move these ones all the way back to that first impact, like so. So that did affect the curve there. So what we can do is literally just remove this keyframe then, and then move these ones back, like so. Let's see what happens then. Now that feels heavier. Now note, I want you to note that this timing is exactly the same on the 4. Look at this, exactly the same. But it feels faster. How crazy is that? All right, how crazy is that? It's just a trick of the eye, really. But it feels way heavier. And it's down to the way it reacts with the ground and with itself rather than the fall. It's not about the fall, it's about the reaction from the fall that makes things feel heavy and dense. Let's play that a few times more. Just watch it back and you can see just how, I don't know, it just feels heavy and dense. Same size ball, same start, same impact at the start, but the reaction is different, so you get a different feeling. So weight and density and the way you animate it is all about the reaction rather than the starting point. All right, with that being said, let's actually do the opposite now. Let's get this third ball feeling super light and super breezy and like a beach ball of sorts. So as you can imagine, it's pretty much going to be the opposite. We're going to give the ball more air time and really accentuate the squash and stretch, make it feel like it's really pushing down into the ground and lifting back up. So it almost feels like it's on the moon. So we're going to give that a go. All right, so let's go ahead and do that now. So going back to that default ball bounce, and one of the first things we can probably do is just extend the squash and stretch and really accentuate that hold. So let's go ahead and do that here. So these 2 frames here on the impact, you can see here, the only thing that's changing is the squash and stretch. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is select everything here and just push it forward by about a frame or 2. And so just see what happens with the first bounce at the beginning. So again, I'm not adjusting that first impact. The fall is exactly the same. So already that feels a lot different. That impact into the ground is feeling way softer. So it's really pushing into that ground. Boom. So we can do the same thing for the rest of these ball bounces. So the next impact would be here. It's going to do the same thing here. So selecting anything from there onwards. Move it forward 1 frame. One more here. And at this point, I would actually go ahead and think about the amount of energy lost over time as well. In that, once it starts to lose energy, that impact will be shorter and the amount of energy in that ball bounce will be less so. So again, we need to think about the fact that, eventually we don't have any squash and stretch at all here as well. So a lot of that can be the same at this point in time. So let's have a look and see what the difference is now. It's feeling a lot more like squishy at the very least. All right, so what we can do now is extend out the timing on the hold. Another thing we can actually do as well is just play with the hang time in the air. The amount of time it stays in that top spot of the ball bounce. So what I'm basically doing is slowing the ball down quite dramatically at the top. And what we end up having is something that feels a lot more floaty. All right, cool. Last thing we can do is essentially the opposite of the first heavy bounce, and that is to extend the amount of time it takes to react and then fall. So let's go ahead and extend our timeline by about, 100 frames. And what I'm going to do is grab the keyframes from the peak and just move them across a little bit. 1, 2, 3. And I can do that across everything. So just go grab everything there, push G and then 3. On that first bounce, I'm really going to extend that one out. From here on in, I'm going to do a G and 2 to move it across 2 frames. G and 2 once more. Do the same thing over here. So I might do G and 1 in this case. G1, 1 frame out. And then once it hits the ground, G and 1. We have to play with that squash and stretch a little bit as well, obviously. So let's just see what the difference is. Boom. You can see here, already it's feeling so much lighter in that motion. It looks almost like a beach ball. And because we're adding that extra hang time as well, we can accentuate that even further. You're really going to make it feel quite strongly like it's floating in the air. Because what you're doing as well is because we're not working in a vacuum in animation land either. We're working within the parameters of so-called physics. So the balls will also have to experience air resistance and all that sort of stuff if you think about it in that level. So a lighter ball will hit that air pockets or the density of the air and slow down quite rapidly. So you can think about it in that term if that's how your brain works as well. And that's kind of how my brain works a little bit. And then what we can do here is really push down that squash and stretch a little bit more. And even extend out the reaction time as well, somewhat. So as it lifts off, it goes back into a circle a bit slower. Do the same thing over here, extend that out a little bit. Squish that down even further. And eventually the ball bounce will kind of react in a similar way to the first one because again, we're losing energy over time. So eventually we can make it feel kind of similar in that regard. And if you really wanted to, depending on how bouncy you want that ball to be, you could possibly extend the amount of bounces as well. Let's just double check to see how the timing of the bounces are with the impact. So for instance, my squash and stretch is a little bit off kilter here. So what I'm going to do is just move that across to match. There we go. Same thing over here. Let's just fix that up a little bit. There we go. Let's have a look at that reaction now. And that's it, really. That's my quick little tips on how to animate weight in terms of heaviness and lightness. And of course, this is a quick little demo, so of course it could be improved in different ways. It can be modified and like refined, but those are my general tips when it comes to animating weight into your system. So don't think about it in terms of just how quickly something falls. Think about how it reacts. It's about reaction. It's about how things react with impacts, how it absorbs energy, how that object interacts with other elements within the scene to give it the sense or give it the impression of a certain level of density of that object. So a much denser object will have less squash and stretch. Sorry, a more dense object will have less squash and stretch, whereas a less dense object will have more squash and stretch in some regards. And of course, in terms of the way it reacts with the environment, so less bounces overall, to give it that sense that the ground is absorbing a lot more of that energy. The ball is transferring a lot of that energy into the ground. Whereas with the lighter ball, it can kind of either have less or something similar to the default one. And then of course, how much time it spends in the air once it reacts with that object. So in this case, the ground, how much time does it take to react? Does the ball spend in the air overall? And these are the sort of things you can apply to anything: a person, a vehicle, a rock, anything. It could be literally anything. These same principles can be applied in that regard. Anyway, I hope you found that informative, and I hope you have fun trying this out for yourself. And hopefully you'll be able to get something that feels more authentic, a bit more realistic in regards to, or at least more satisfying, appealing rather, in your animations. So try it out with this ball bounce, and then once you've sort of mastered this first little task, try it out with some more complicated rigs. So maybe a character, or maybe something like an object like a car, or I don't know, a hammer, whatever you can think of. And see how you go. But hopefully you found this informative. I find this to be really informative when I try to be conscious of it. So hopefully it works out for you guys as well. So with that being said, let me know how you go in the comments. If you have any questions, feel free to message me in the comment section, or if you're on my Patreon, message me through Patreon. Apart from that, all I'm going to say is catches and have fun. Cheers.